So Oxfordianism is the, let's say, theory that Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, wrote the works of William Shakespeare behind a pseudonym. So basically, to give a very brief overview of the history, there was kind of a big wave of Shakespeare authorship, conspiratorial thinking in the 19th century, where writers like, Mark Twain writes a book called Is Shakespeare Dead?, where he calls the traditional Stratfordian narrative an Eiffel Tower of artificialities. Henry James says that the Stratford man, the divine will, is the greatest fraud ever practiced on a patient world. So it's Ralph Waldo Emerson, Walt Whitman, Helen Keller, all these kind of luminaries of the age are talking about the obvious flaws that seem to be emerging in the traditional narrative of who Shakespeare was. And so there was all this activity around it, and people end up thinking maybe Francis Bacon is put forth as the leading candidate. And the problem is it almost ends up being a red herring that kind of ends up, people really pursue it with a lot of enthusiasm, but then it ends up kind of about ciphers and secret codes and things, and it doesn't really lead any place and turns into kind of like a cul-de-sac, and then the whole thing kind of loses momentum. And so by 1920, there's a school teacher, like a grammar school teacher living in a small town in England named J.T. Loney. And he basically kind of wants to solve it in the tradition of like 19th century, detective novels, where he's like, okay, who done it? And so he ends up looking through the historical annals, trying to understand, like, okay, he has like a long list of criteria of like, okay, somebody who had a reputation for being eccentric, somebody who had Lancastrian sympathies politically, somebody who could have been in a place where they could have experienced this type of educational background, somebody who maybe went to Italy, like on and on. And so he was looking for who matches this checklist, and he was looking through the historical records. And there was this one person who seemed like, for lack of a better word, had been kind of canceled, where it seemed like he was celebrated at a time for having been a noted playwright, and people talked about his comedies as having been the best in all the Renaissance period, but no one can find what plays he wrote. And it seems as though he had this pretty precipitous fall from grace and was exiled from court and all these different things. And so he, J.T. Loney in 1920 writes his famous landmark, should have a national holiday celebrating it, book called Shakespeare Identified in Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. And so he was, by this point, because Baconianism had gotten a bad rap and he was just a normal guy, school teacher, he kind of got the ivory tower, kind of laughed him out of business and made fun of his name, Loney, because it's spelled loony. And so there was all these articles about making fun of him. But he was the one who put forth, I think he was the one who called it Oxfordianism, which I think is also an unfortunate name because it obviously doesn't say who Edward de Vere is. I think a big problem is people don't know who Edward de Vere was. Like, there's no sense of him as a personality. And so that's what Linds and I are really trying to do, is make you understand, like, and that's why we talk about John Mulaney or Robin Williams, Steve Martin. Like, how do you see this person in your head who is a human, like a flesh and blood artist that was connected to these works? And so that's kind of what our project, that this documentary series that we're working on, is aiming to do. I'm friends with Rima Greenhill, who's a professor at Stanford, who just wrote a book about Edward de Vere's, stuff. And there's professors at Tulane who we're in touch with, and Wash U. And like, that's just to kind of name drop, like, kind of, academic institutions. But it's like Hillary Clinton wrote a fan letter to this girl that we know about her book about it. So it's like, it seems like it's a lot, even like, Mark Rylance and Sir Derek Jacobi. Mark Rylance, who was the artistic director of Shakespeare's Globe Theater, comes to the conferences. So it's actually, it feels less of a conspiracy theory and more of like a elite in group of people who are kind of in the know. And like, it just feels like it, for whatever reason, that paradigm shift hasn't happened more broadly throughout the culture, but it seems as though all the momentum is leading towards our side of the question.